Let's set the scene. I started drawing in April of 2021. The reason I started drawing was because my favorite manga, Attack on Titan, ended terribly, and I wanted to make my own ending. So now let's go over the first mistake I made. As I was waiting for my tablet to arrive, I remember I watched some Ethan Becker videos, specifically the one about doing face breakdowns. When I first started drawing, I relied on doing face breakdowns as a crutch to draw the face because drawing was so overwhelmingly difficult. And worse, the way I did them was basically tracing with extra steps, which means I didn't learn anything from doing them. Face breakdowns can be a really powerful tool when learning to draw the face, but not if you just trace. Here's how I would now recommend doing them. So what you're going to do is get a reference photo, duplicate it, and lower the opacity of the second one, and then you'll begin to do a breakdown. Center line through the face, circle through the cranium, and then just draw the jaw. Now, very important, turn the second reference off. From here, you will draw the facial features as best you can, and the reason this works is because it doesn't matter how bad you screw up. In fact, I'll mess it up on purpose. And once you've placed the features, turn the underlying reference back on, and right here, you have picture-perfect feedback on every single one of your mistakes. I would also advise against relying on doing these whenever you draw a face. You should practice both breakdowns, drawing after reference, and after imagination. And eventually you can stop doing breakdowns. But a lot of my early drawings were basically traced. Though at even tracing, I was so bad that it still looked terrible. So for my first 3 months of drawing, that's the biggest mistake I made. However, I did do some things right. For one, I drew a lot. Not just in terms of hours spent, and I did spend a lot of hours, but I drew a bunch of different drawings instead of spending a lot of time on one drawing. This was good because when you are learning art, the most important things are the fundamentals: form, value, perspective, composition, and so on. And basically, these 4 fundamentals that go into any given drawing are resolved in the early stages of any art piece. Let me do a drawing to demonstrate. Here's the sketch. This took a few minutes. The composition and perspective are in place, as well as the facial features and the structure. If I start painting it, I'll add the base shadow values and then the base light values. This took another few minutes. The form and value are now in place. I can spend hours on it and deal with rendering and brushwork and color and fancy stuff, but those things only really matter if the fundamentals are in place. And so if you do, let's say 3 drawings, and you render them out fully and you spend 5 hours each on them, in total, you've only spent maybe 1 out of 15 hours practicing the fundamentals. Whereas if you made a bunch of drawings only up to this stage, you could have gotten 15 hours of practicing the fundamentals. Now, this is of course an example taken to the extreme just to prove a point. Another thing I did right was that I didn't think that much about improvement at this stage. Basically, I was just having fun. When you first start drawing, it is so overwhelming that if you immediately focus on trying to get better, you just might forget to have fun, and then it doesn't matter. Focus on having fun first. Don't look so much at other artists. Comparing yourself to other artists and trying to learn from them can help a lot at a later stage, but not as a complete beginner. So I knew I was bad at art, but I didn't really care, at least after the first shock of discovering how difficult art is. I just drew what I wanted to draw, which helped me build up the confidence with drawing and drawing new things and challenging things, which then allowed me to try to get better. So 3 months in, I've started a new story project of my own. I've now started painting my drawings, although it was mostly base colors, as I was far too intimidated by trying to paint strong lights or shadows. If I did add any shading, it would be with an airbrush, which on the one hand, that's a mistake, but on the other hand, I allowed myself not to try to learn everything all at once. At this stage, I knew there were things called the fundamentals. I was aware of this thing called the sorrow head, but I didn't understand any of it. And what I mean is that painting faces with a strong light scenario is the best way to learn about facial structure, because it forces you to make a decision about what you think the structure of the face is. And references with such lighting actually give you the information to try and do that. Of course, it's very difficult at first. Rather than just adding some little shadows with an airbrush, it feels easier because you're not making any clear decisions. And references with soft lighting give you less information to actually learn from them as a beginner. So yes, in order to learn about painting faces, use strong lighting and avoid just adding some shading with an airbrush. But when you get to the point where you can kind of start to try and improve, don't overwhelm yourself by trying to learn everything all at once. So in the first month, I drew just with lines. In the second, I added some base values. In the third, I added color and I tried to paint it, but it took me until month 5 and 6 to really start painting with strong lights and shadows. Allow things to take their time. It is okay. It is good, even. With all of the things I had to draw to tell the story I wanted to tell, it was the perfect challenge. The difficulty was so high that I was completely engaged. I was completely focused. I was completely present. Had I made it any more or any less difficult, it all would have fallen apart. Had I made it easier and more comfortable, I would have gotten bored. Had I made it more difficult, I would have gotten frustrated and overwhelmed. But for the first year of doing art, I was able to stay in this sweet spot. It was mainly because I was such a loser. I did not care for the world, other people, or anything around me. But it also came down to how high I placed the bar. Early on, I kept it very low. If I had a scene to draw, I didn't expect myself to come up with the most interesting and dynamic way to frame it. I didn't expect myself to render it thoroughly. I just sketched something, usually went with the first thing I came up with, and I rarely spent more than 3 hours on a piece. I used custom and textured brushes to paint trees and plants and such, to speed things up and lower the perceived difficulty. And as I went along, I raised the bar, like making an effort to paint faces with strong lighting. Here at month 7, I tried to paint lighting while studying the sorrow head. The sorrow head still felt like a complete mystery to me. I didn't understand how it really reflected the structure of real faces. Here's probably the earliest painting I did following photo reference. As in, I mostly used photo reference to draw up to this point. It was a bit too intimidating to try and paint after reference until now. I was also using video reference to draw fight scenes, which I had also learned from watching Ethan Becker. Again, with how I did face breakdowns, when I did whole body breakdowns, it was basically just tracing with extra steps. When I was doing this fight scene, I also tried to paint the metal to really make it look like metal. And I think this is when I first started painting with ambient and bounce light. On this piece, for example, there's the direct sunlight coming at this angle, and then there's the blue skylight coming from above. And then there's also bounce light from the field. Ambient and bounce light will be much more visible on metal than on the clothes, for example. Look at this, I'm even doing some subsurface scattering in the ear, which is an easy trick to make skin feel like skin, at a warm saturated gradient where the light fades to shadow. So I'm slowly taking in more aspects of art. When I first started chaining, I was only concerned with the form of the object. Now I'm starting to consider the material of the object. I should also mention that after about month 4 and up to I think month 15, I actually had an art mentor. My half-brother is a professional concept artist, and I paid him to give me, well, lessons isn't really the right word. I would show him what I painted that week, and we would talk about it. He was a really great mentor at this time because he never gave me any harsh critique. He would give me tips and insights on things like character design and composition. I had a habit of placing the focal points of the scene too far down in the composition. I don't think he saw himself like as my teacher, that it was his job to turn me into a great artist. But I think because of that, he ended up being a better teacher than he otherwise would. Sometimes we just talk about the story of what I was drawing, or maybe he'd show some of his projects. This allowed me to stay in that frame of mind where I was still just having fun. Whereas had he meticulously pointed out all of my mistakes and given me homework and, all that kind of stuff, that very well could have taken the fun out of it. I think that's why it's so common for artists that go to art school to lose their passion. Getting critique is great for learning, but it doesn't really matter how correct a given critique is if it doesn't inspire the artists receiving it. So while I didn't go to art school, I'm technically not self-taught since I did have a mentor. Around month 8 or 9, I decided to go back to the first story project I did and redo it. And I decided to do it in grayscale, which was a really good decision because this allowed me to really focus on values. In digital painting, one really big advantage we have is that when it comes to learning value in color, we can just learn them separately. A traditional painter would have to learn values while working in color, which is a lot more difficult because color is far more complicated than values, despite values being more important. While we can isolate values and learn them without having color in the way, then we can go on to learn color when we now have a good understanding of values. I also ended up learning a lot about expression as this project went along, although I still had a very poor understanding of facial structure. Which makes sense, and I'm still a beginner, but I did hinder myself due to the mistake of having a certain way to shade certain things. The nose, for example. I would basically shade it with one shadow like this, with no separation between the bulb of the nose and the nostrils. And the point I'm making here isn't that I made the mistake of not understanding noses. There were a ton of things I didn't understand. But that I had a predetermined method of drawing and painting noses which didn't allow me to be open to actually learn more and make progress towards understanding noses better. There were a couple other things like that, and it was basically because all these drawings are all part of one project, and for this one, more so than the others I made, I wanted it to look cohesive, and as such, I didn't experiment as much as I would have. Take this piece, for example. I knew there was more to the structure than what I was showing. I knew there would be more shading on the sides of the face. Not that I understood it, I had an idea about what should be there. So I simplified. And simplifying, if you understand what you're simplifying, then that's good. If you don't understand what you're simplifying, then it's bad. Now, that was a simplification, but I understand it. Again, my reasoning was that I wanted the project to look cohesive, so for now, I stuck to painting faces in a certain way. That could have been really detrimental to my growth if this project had lasted for longer than the 5 months I did work on it. But as you will see when I finish this project, I immediately start experimenting a lot. With the completion of that project, I have now drawn for an entire year, so it marks the start of a new chapter. Oh, and when it comes to drawing for years and months, I should say this. Saying that I've been drawing for a year, 3 years, can be a really misleading measurement of time. At least it definitely is in my case, because I drew so much in that first year. I drew on average, 6 hours a day in that first year. That was light work because I was used to playing World of Warcraft 12 hours a day. With the powers of being a NEET and autistic at my side, I was unstoppable. What I mean by this is that, let's say the average artist is a more functional member of society and draws maybe an hour or two every other day. That evens out to 30 minutes a day. So this artist will need to spend 12 years drawing to spend as much time as I did in 1 year. I did slow down though after the first year, and I never reached the same level of obsession with art again. With the start of the second year, I did start a new story project, but I never end up completing it, as I also start doing individual studies. I'm now consistently painting after reference, rather than just drawing after reference, but I was also doing some stuff from imagination. One of the things that helped me a ton at this time was I started painting skulls, and then I realized that skulls are the missing link to understand facial structure. Before, let's say during month 6 or 7, I knew face structure was a thing. I knew about the Asaro head, but back then, the Asaro head on its own was too complex and overwhelming. With time, like at the end of the first year, I began to understand the Asaro head on its own more, but when I looked at the Asaro head, and then I looked at portraits, I thought, there's something in between here that I have no idea about. But now I figured out what that was. It was the skull. Skulls are the key to understanding faces. I also discovered they're really fun to paint. Here's probably the first one I did from imagination, and as you can see, there's not a lot going on here. But here's the second one. There's still a lot missing, but it's starting to look like a skull. Here's another one. I would guess that I use reference for this one. I also didn't just do close-ups. I did some wider shots of the undead that I still really like, and I want to do stuff like this again. Oh, and for this piece, I had just watched a video by Marco Bucci that really inspired me. It was the one about edges, and it was like it opened my eyes to a whole new world. How hard edges demand attention, and lost edges lets the viewer use their own imagination. And so again, I'm slowly adding more complexity to painting. From only thinking about the form when shading, then also the material, now also considering edges and how that affects the composition. Challenging yourself, yet allowing things to take their time. With this newfound appreciation for skulls, I had a much easier time with structure when painting faces. I still struggled with the faces not turning out how I wanted to. Sometimes I liked them, and sometimes the rendering just turned out weird. That happens to this day because art is hard. I gradually started doing less story pieces and more individual studies, which I have mixed feelings about. Maybe it was a necessary step for me, but it really opened the gate to frustration, lack of motivation, and burnout. Burnout does not come from creating too much. Burnout comes from not doing what you really want to do. If the art you are creating is true to your heart, then the more time, focus, and energy you put into it, the more motivation you will have. And so it's a positive feedback loop, which is how I was able to draw for hours every day in the first year and have so much fun doing it. I was now drawing between 1 and 3 hours per day, and I was frustrated a lot of the time because I was now drawing so that I could get better at drawing, so that I could make a social media following, so I could make money, so I could pursue my dreams. And some of those are good things, but it's reliant on results, and you're never gonna get good results all of the time. Still though, despite frustration, I continued on. I was really trying to study art now. I was doing deliberate practice on things I needed to work on, and I tried to break these subjects down into manageable chunks. For faces, I was doing grayscale portrait studies with strong lighting scenarios. They weren't very pretty, but I was now becoming confident in the structure of faces, which built the foundation to then allow me to tackle rendering and, making them look good. I did some copies of other artists, a few environmental studies, and luckily I would occasionally just do an art piece that I wanted to make, just for fun, not for the sake of studying it. But it was mostly doing portrait studies. Then I got really into dresses for a while. After that, it was a mix of pieces with an actual meaning and random studies. And so for this time period, from August 2022 to the end of 2022, first, let's go through my mistakes based on what I was trying to do. Then we can talk about the problem of trying to do what I was trying to do. First of all, the things I was studying was very unbalanced. I had far too much focus on the fundamentals of painting and far too little on the fundamentals of drawing. Even though I wanted to be more of a painter than a drawer, I hold on to that, but painting is still reliant on the fundamentals of drawing. And I did zero figure drawing. And essentially, I didn't learn anything about perspective. Before, when I was working on my stories, even though I didn't deliberately practice these things, I would still get experience with them. Drawing fight scenes is a great way to do figure drawing, and I would much more often try to do shots with more interesting perspective and framing when I was working on stories than I did when I was just doing studies. So once I stopped making my stories, I stopped gaining any experience in those two fundamental areas, and this is reflected in my work to this day. It's very straightforward with basic framing, and the posing and movement of my pieces is very stiff. So focusing so much on portrait painting, for one, made me ignore other fundamentals, but even if I just consider getting better at portraits, it may not have been counterproductive, but it wasn't as productive as it seemed. Because a portrait painting is obviously made up of portrait-specific elements, the structure of the face and the features, which are obviously vital. And there are minor things like knowing how to make skin look like skin, hair look like hair. But then there's obviously so much of a portrait painting that isn't specific to portraits. Brushwork, rendering, colors, simplifications, and so on. So once you get to the point where you have a good understanding of the portrait-specific elements of a portrait, you don't necessarily need to paint portraits to continue to improve your portraits. You could practice the general fundamentals while focusing on other subjects, the body, environments, animals, and what you can learn about the general fundamentals will improve your portraits when you do get back to them. Not to mention, you would improve in those other subjects, anatomy, landscapes, and etc. So I believe that I could have focused less on portraits, still improved on them about as much as I did, while improving a lot in these other subjects and fundamentals. I also believe that I should have done less from reference and more from imagination. When I was working on stories, I had the perfect balance between the two. Because you won't be able to find references for everything you want to do when you're making stories. So you're forced to do stuff from imagination. And when you do that, you realize, reference is great and all, but I don't need it to make something interesting. And that confidence applies to all art, even when you do use a reference. Because you know you don't have to do everything like the reference. And generally, the most fulfilling art pieces to create, and the ones that are the most interesting and beautiful to behold, are the ones where you have references, but you don't copy them, and you do some of it from imagination. Copies are good for learning, but when you only do those, you forget that you can do more than just copy. You lose the confidence. And the art you choose to make also changes. You draw something when you find something cool to copy, instead of wanting to draw a thing and then finding a reference to help with that. Now, as for the problems with trying to do what I was trying to do, which is basically desperately try to get better, I do not recommend it. But if you are in a similar situation to me, where you feel that I just have to make a living as an artist, it's the only thing I can do, I have to do it. Here's some advice. Do not fall into the trap of feeling that you have to sacrifice authenticity for appeal. I knew that would be a dumb thing to do, but I was still influenced by feeling that if I make paintings of skulls, undead, knights, and soldiers, then no one will pay attention to it compared to art of cute stylized girls. I feel that no one would watch my YouTube videos if they weren't hyper-edited. I now realize that authenticity, the truth of who you are, the soul of your being and your work, is the only thing that makes people care about you. You can be a literal god at art, but if you make artwork without passion, then people will not care. Now, of course, you can't chase your own authenticity on the basis that people will like you if you are authentic, but it means you can relax. When you realize there is inherent value to authenticity and passion, you can let go of all your fears that you're not good enough or that nobody cares, and proceed with this confidence and optimism that you feel everything is going to work out, as long as you walk the path that is true to your heart. As for getting better, grinding your way to get better at art, like I did, is something that only works for a while. It's unsustainable. Art is not a sport that you can perform even if you don't like it. You need to enjoy it to make art that matters. The discipline of an artist is not to push through when it's not fun, but rather to find ways to make it fun. And that goes back to finding that path that is true to your heart. Because all of the good things about art come from the same path. The path to improving the most is the path that is the most fun. The path that is the most fun is the path that is the most authentic. The path that is the most authentic is the path to external success. However, that doesn't mean you can reach that path by chasing those things. If you chase improvement or you chase success, you will get led astray, like I did. With the start of 2023, I was now at the point in my plan to start putting stuff up on social media. At first, I felt quite good about my art. After being mostly frustrated for months, I felt that a lot of improvement came all at once after all of that studying. But this would be contrasted when I realized how hard it is to be seen on social media. Since I was pursuing it on the basis of achieving the results I wanted, this was an even bigger source of frustration. I realized YouTube was the only platform where I had any chance, but I also realized making YouTube videos is an art form in and of itself, which I was completely new at. And my approach to art in the year of 2023 was made worse by my approach to YouTube. I was trying to make YouTube videos, and then I made art for those videos, instead of just making art, making the videos about that. There was something that I didn't realize yet, but I was now at the point where improving my art was no longer linear. What I mean by that is that if you go to my first year of art, as I got better, my art looked better. As I leveled up in technical skill and knowledge about art, it was reflected in my art looking better and more interesting. But at some point along the way, this was no longer the case. I could now increase my skill in art without actually going to art that looked any better or any more interesting. At worst, it could become less interesting. And since I wasn't really aware of it yet, I was still trying to improve by trying to get better technically. And I was trying to make art that was interesting. And in this time period, spring of 2023, I feel I did create pieces that I still find interesting, but I just wasn't able to replicate it. And ever since then, my art has gotten less interesting, even if I have gotten better technically. I was also still trying to get better at the same subjects, mostly portraits. I was still not doing any figure drawing or perspective drawing, both of which contribute a lot to making interesting art. And at this stage, I pointed out earlier how I was doing too much from reference and not enough from imagination. This has a lot to do with my art not being interesting. I wasn't really training my imagination anymore. And so much of what makes a piece interesting is that what you do from imagination and how you use your imagination to interpret any reference you have. Ever since I stopped making stories back in August of 2022, I've lost my way in terms of the true path of my art. And I've been aware of it this whole time because I know that the reason I want to draw is to make stories. It's why I started. It's why I still draw. It's what gives meaning to my art. The reason I stopped making stories is because it takes so much mental space to draw stories. because you need space to get absorbed into this fantasy world and care so much about all the characters. And early on in 2022, that's when I started caring about the real world. And I, at least internally, stopped being such a loser. And with that came the idea to make a living as an artist. And combined with the fact that I now had less space to care about my story worlds, because I now cared about things in the real world, it was also the problem that I wasn't able to reconcile making art because I want to make it, when in the back of my mind there was the idea that I was making art because I had to make a living as an artist. And so my ambition became corrupted and I was lost. I was just wandering around, making random art. And, sometimes I'd make art that I still find is interesting, but most of it is just meh. It has no meaning. In making this video, I'm looking back at so many art pieces that I'd completely forgotten about. I haven't seen them since I originally drew them. And it's made me realize that these last 2 years, I have really tried, but that's a bad thing. In the first year of doing art, when I was on average drawing 6 hours a day, there were days when I drew 8 or 10 hours, but I wasn't trying. I was just doing. I was doing what I wanted to do. I didn't have to try. I didn't want to make art. I just wanted to make art, so I did it. But ever since then, and it's so strange because back then I was such a loser. I mean, I was a dumb piece of shit. But now, these last 2 years, I've been trying. I've been wanting to make art. I've been trying to be an artist. This part wasn't in the script. I'm recording this as I'm editing the end of the video. And, maybe I'm ruining the video. Maybe it's a shame to end it on a negative note. I was supposed to talk about art style, and I was supposed to talk about the fact that I finally started figure drawing, and I've been trying to get better at traditional drawing, but I don't know about anything anymore, man. I mean, maybe it's for completely unrelated reasons, or maybe I've given my life to my art and lost my mind in the process. No, you know what? I'm keeping this in because all of my other YouTube videos, they're fucking garbage. I was just trying to make content to get views. I was copying other people's thumbnails. I was copying their titles. I was trying to retention edit. I was thinking about what's trendy, what's going to get me the best click-through rate. Like all this meaningless, worthless, stupid fucking garbage. I want to make something real, man. I want to make art that captures the love for beautiful things. But I also don't want to pretend that everything is perfect, that I'm perfect. I'm losing my fucking mind, honestly. But that's real, man. Real shit.